بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه الطيبين الطاهرين. Let's make our intentions sincerely for the sake of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Today, inshallah, we are going to speak about the power of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Know that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ means that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has power over absolutely everything. Now, when we say Allah has power over absolutely everything, this refers to the power of Allah, which is His eternal and everlasting attribute. The attribute of Allah, His power, which exists without a beginning and without an end. This attribute of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, it is by it that Allah creates things. By it that Allah brings things from non-existence to the state of existence. It is by this attribute that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala also takes things out of existence. Creating a takween, it is an attribute that is only an attribute of Allah. It is not an attribute of any other thing, any other creation. Rather, it is only to be attributed to Allah. Anybody who says that there is something other than Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala that is attributed with the power that is without a beginning, this person is judged as a non-Muslim. Likewise, it is important to know that when we say that Allah has power over everything, what this means is everything that it is possible for it to exist. So, there are things that can exist, that we can imagine in our minds. These are called al-mumkinat al-aqliyah. Things that it's possible that they will exist. However, there are also things, concepts, that are impossible, things that cannot exist. Okay? So these things, what do we say about them? These things that can exist, we say, yes, of course, Allah has power over them. The power of Allah relates to these things, meaning because that thing itself, it accepts to come into existence. Okay? Because we can imagine it. It's a possibility. However, those things that are impossible to exist, those things that it is impossible for them to exist, we say that the power of Allah is not related to this matter. We say, قدرة الله لا تتعلق بهذا الأمر الذي هو مستحيل عقلا الذي هو ممنوع عقلا الذي هو محال عقلا قدرة الله لا تتعلق بهذه الأشياء. I'll give you an example of something that will never exist, and it cannot exist. It's a contradiction to the sound mind. This matter and the likes of this matter, the power of Allah does not relate to them. I'll give you an example first of something that doesn't relate to something. Like if somebody says about a stone, if somebody says that this stone, is it a Muslim or is it a kafir? It doesn't apply. You can't say about a stone, is it a Muslim or is it a kafir? You can't, because the question doesn't apply to the stone. The question does not apply to the stone. Likewise, there are things that cannot exist. So because it is impossible for them to exist, we don't say that, yes, Allah, for example, His power relates to it. No, because the power of Allah relates to those things that it is possible for them to exist. I'll give you another example of something that cannot exist now. If someone was to say to you, draw me a 3-sided square, right? A 3-sided square. The first thing you will say to me is, this is impossible because a square has 4 sides. As soon as you say, draw me a 3-sided square, it stopped being a square. So it's impossible for it to exist. So we do not say that the power of Allah relates to it. We say rather, the power of Allah does not relate to this matter because it is impossible for it to exist in the first place. Okay? Like this, if someone said to you, draw me a 4-sided triangle. A 4-sided triangle cannot exist. So we say the power of Allah does not relate to it. Okay? We don't say that, yes, Allah can create it. And we don't say, no, Allah can't create it. We don't say these two things because yes and no do not apply. Likewise, like we mentioned about the wall or the stone, if someone said, is it a Muslim or a kafir? If someone says it's a Muslim, we'd say, well, what are you talking about? It's a stone, it's a rock. And if someone said it's a kafir, we'd say, no, it doesn't apply. You can't call the stone a Muslim or a kafir. In the same way, the impossible matters, the power of Allah does not relate to them. So, like this, there are certain matters that it is impossible for them to exist. Like, for example, if someone said that there were 2 gods, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, it is impossible for more than 1 God to exist. It's impossible. It's impossible. And anything that is impossible, we say the power of Allah doesn't relate to it. Meaning this doesn't even apply. It's something that will never exist and it cannot exist. Okay? So the power of Allah does not relate to it. We don't say yes and we don't say no. Like we don't say, now this is very important for you to listen to this very carefully, because saying yes is kufr and saying no is also kufr. So this question that some people ask, saying yes to it is kufr and saying no to it is kufr. It makes a person a non-Muslim. This type of question that I'm going to mention that some people used to ask and still may ask today, it was something that was produced by the communists, the atheists. And the reason they would ask it was to trick the Muslims, to get the Muslims to commit kufr. So they used to ask this question. And if a Muslim says yes to it, he becomes a non-Muslim. And if he says no to it, he also becomes a non-Muslim. What is the correct answer before I mention the question? The correct answer is the power of Allah does not relate to the intellectually impossible matters. The power of Allah does not relate to the intellectual impossibilities. The things that will never exist and cannot exist and are impossible. The power of Allah doesn't relate to it. So we don't say yes, that Allah can do it, and we don't say no, Allah can't do it. We don't say yes or no. Rather, we say that Qudratullahi la tata'allaqu bil mustahil al-aqli, that the power of Allah does not relate to it. So what is this question, or a type of this question that some people used to ask? And the one that asks it becomes a kafir. The one that says yes becomes a kafir. The one that says no becomes a kafir. The one that is saved is the one that says the power of Allah does not relate to the intellectual impossibilities. And that your question is wrong. This is a trick. So the question, for example, is, remember, we don't say yes or no. The question is that some people in the past used to ask. They used to say, can Allah create another God? If someone says yes, that Allah can create another God, then this means that it's okay, it's permissible for there to be two gods. And this is against La ilaha illallah, and this is kufr. If someone says yes, Allah can create another God, then this is kufr. If someone says no, then this is also kufr, because they have attributed weakness to Allah. They've said that Allah doesn't have the power to such and such. They've said, in other words, Allah is weak. So they've said no, that Allah cannot create another God. They have committed kufr also. Someone who says that yes, he can, they become a non-Muslim. Someone that says no, he can't, then he also becomes a non-Muslim. The correct answer is that this matter, this question, it is a contradiction. The power of Allah does not relate to intellectual impossibilities. It's as though they said, is it possible for Allah, who there can be no other God other than Allah, and He is the only God, is it possible then for there to be another God? It's a contradiction. A person is already saying that there can be no other God other than Allah, and so on, and He's the only God, and then they say, well, can there then be another God? This is a contradiction. So the right answer is that we don't say yes, that Allah can, because that would mean that there can be another so-called God, two so-called gods, and that is obviously against La ilaha illallah. This is kufr. And if someone says no, that God cannot, then this person is attributing weakness to Allah. In actual fact, it's impossible for there to be another God. It is impossible. But we don't attribute this saying. We don't attribute weakness to Allah. We don't say Allah cannot. We don't say Allah is not able, or Allah is not powerful, or that Allah is powerless over. Rather, we say that this person asked a question. If someone says yes, then it doesn't befit. And if someone says no, this also doesn't befit. So you can't say yes and you can't say no. Rather, you say the power of Allah does not relate to intellectual impossibilities. Okay, what does the power of Allah relate to then? What is it that Allah has eternally willed to create or not create? It is matters that can come into existence. However wild and however big or small they may be, things that you can actually imagine that it's possible for them to come into existence. These things, yes, we say Allah has power over them. In other words, Allah has power over everything. And when we say everything, we mean al-mumkin al-aqli, the intellectually possible matters. Because the mustahil al-aqli, the intellectually impossible matters, they don't even exist. So you don't even need to care about them. So when we say Allah has power over everything, right, the intellectual impossibilities, they're just brushed away because they're just concepts, impossible concepts. So when we say Allah has power over everything, we refer to the things that can actually come into existence. Okay? And this is not an attribution of weakness to Allah. It is a praise. It is a praise of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to say that He has power over everything, and that the intellectually impossible matters, well, they're impossible, so why are we talking about them? But in the past, the communists, the atheists, they played a trick on the Muslims, and they asked many Muslims these questions, and because of the ignorance of those Muslims, they either said yes to one of those questions or no, thinking that, for example, oh yeah, Allah Ta'ala can create, has power over everything. They said yes then to there being another so-called God, and they went against the core of belief, La ilaha illallah, no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah, that there is no God except Allah. And some of them, they would get really scared when they asked this question. When someone would ask them, well, can God create another God? So then they'd get really scared and say, oh, no, because we believe in La ilaha illallah. So they'd say no, meaning that God can't do that. And by that, they'd be attributing weakness to Allah and they'd commit kufr. So again, I know I've repeated it a lot, but it's important. We say the power of Allah does not relate to the intellectually impossible matters. Rather, the power of Allah relates only to the intellectually possible matters. What is an intellectual possibility? That thing which a person's mind can conceive the existence of at one time and the non-existence of at another time. Like you and I, a person, they can imagine themselves existing and they can imagine themselves having not existed. The mind accepts that originally. It accepts that a person like me or you would exist, or at this time they would not exist, right? As for Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, Allah, his existence is not intellectually possible, because the possibility means that it might exist, it might not exist, but Allah must exist. So the existence of Allah is intellectually wajib, absolutely necessary. Allah must exist. It's a must that Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala exists. So by this, we have summarized, if you haven't already noticed, the three judgments of the mind. The intellectually necessary, which existence is the existence of Allah and the attributes of Allah, and that's it in that category. The existence of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala and the existence of the attributes of Allah that are attributed to him subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they are wajib. This is intellectually necessary. Then the second category is the category of the intellectually impossible, those things that can never exist. So you have the intellectually necessary, Allah and his attributes, which must exist. The intellectually impossible are the matters that cannot exist. And then the matters in the middle, like you and I in this world, that originally we are intellectually possible, meaning that it was possible that we would not have existed. The mind can conceive our existence and non-existence. So this is a very important matter in the knowledge of at-Tawheed. This is knowledge about Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, and it is the best type of knowledge. It is the best knowledge. There is no knowledge more honorable and more or better than the knowledge about Allah. Learning about the attributes of Allah, it is the best knowledge. So spend your time learning about Allah, learning about what it is permissible to attribute to Allah, what it is a must to attribute to Allah, so a person can know their creator. Because Al-Ghazali said, لا تصح العبادة إلا بعد معرفة المعبود. He said that a person's worship, the acts of worship, the prayer, zakah, fasting, being generous, being good to one's parents, bringing up one's children, providing for one's wife, they said none of this matters. None of this is valid except after a person knows their creator, meaning they have that obligatory knowledge about Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Then when they know that which they are worshipping, i.e. Allah, it is then that their worship will be valid, and hence if they do it in the correct way, their worship will even be rewardable. So it's important for every single person to know these matters. Imagine your sons in their schools and your daughters in their schools. Things like this from the kuffar, they may come up and they ask these questions. And so prepare them. Teach them the religious knowledge. Teach them the details. And it's not hard. Really, it's not hard. The intellect was praised many times in the Quran. Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala addressed in the Quran many people by revealing, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ? Do you not use your intellect, your aql? أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ? Do they not use their uqul? Do they not use their intellects? Do they not reason with the sound mind rationally and intellectually? The people of hellfire, as is mentioned in Surah Tabarak, Surah Mulk, they will say, had we reasoned intellectually, had we learned and had we reasoned intellectually, we would not have been amongst the people of hellfire. لو كنا نسمع أو نعقل ما كنا في that had we reasoned intellectually and had we listened with an open heart, we would not have been in the punishment. We would not have been in hellfire. So it is important for us to learn these matters. It is not hard. Shall I tell you something? Some people, because they have been for a while far away, or they've been deprived of the authentic knowledge of Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah. In deep, the authentic knowledge of Ahlus Sunnati wal Jama'ah, because they have been deprived and they've never heard this, which the books of the scholars are full of these things, because they've never heard and their minds have stopped functioning in that way, where they're not used to these concepts or these intellectual proofs. They're just used to their day-to-day business, right? They find it harder to understand. Minds nowadays, the scholars have said that our minds are much weaker. Many people, their minds are much weaker than before. Subhanallah, because there are so many distractions. So it's important for a person to learn the religious knowledge, especially about Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So remember the statement, قدرة الله تعالى لا تتعلق بالمستحيل العقلي. The answer to some of those questions is that it's not yes and it's not no. It is the power of Allah does not relate to the intellectually impossible. Make sure you write it down. Make sure you have it down. Make sure it's memorized. So not only will you be able to articulate yourself in the correct way, but at the same time, you will be protecting yourself from this potential trap. So the power of Allah is not related to the intellectually impossible matters that cannot exist. And we will stop there today. Walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wasallam.